Thank you very much. I noticed the picture that they used of me up on the screen was from 10 years ago. I think that's a really good idea. And the next time, if I'm invited back, I'd like to use a picture from 20 years ago, since I have those available. Or we could even go back further if we want. Thank you to Gamma for inviting me. And I'm pleased to be the one kicking off our evening of storytelling. I wanted to tell you a story about creativity and how creativity is a little more complicated than we realize. And the best way, I think, to tell you this story is to relate a famous meeting between Bob Dylan and Leonard Cohen. They were fans of each other, and they met in Paris in the early 1980s, having a cup of coffee, and they were kind of catching up and telling each other how much they liked their work. And Bob Dylan turns to Leonard Cohen and says, you know, you wrote a song, this song, Hallelujah, which I really, really love. And he's referring, of course, to the most famous song that Leonard Cohen ever wrote and performed, which I'm sure you've all heard. You probably heard it at weddings, or someone played it on the subway for you today. It's one of the most famously covered songs in history. And I think you know how it begins, and I thought I would actually sing it for you, if that's okay.
Now I've heard there was a secret chord that David played, and it pleased the Lord. But you don't really care for music, do you?
Thank you. So Dylan turns to Leonard Cohen and he says, I really love that song. How long did it take you to write it? And Leonard Cohen answers, 2 years. But he's actually lying. It took him 5 years, but he's too embarrassed to admit that it took him this long to write this song. So he shaves a couple years off. And then Leonard Cohen turns to Bob Dylan and says, you know, I also have a favorite song of yours. It was on your Infidels album, and it's called I and I. And in fact, I think we can even hear a little bit of I and I. Are we going to play it? Maybe not. I'm sure some of you know it. But he says, how long did it take you to write I and I? And Dylan says, oh, I don't know, 15 minutes. Now, here we have two absolutely legendary songwriters. They are the greatest singer-songwriters of two of the greatest singer-songwriters of their generation. They're born only a few years apart. They come up together. They're in the same musical tradition. They both have grandparents who fled the pogroms of Eastern Europe. I mean, I could go on and on with the similarities. They love each other's music. They probably covered each other's music at a certain point in their life. But in one crucial respect, they're totally different. Leonard Cohen takes 5 years to write his signature song, and Bob Dylan tosses off I and I, one of his greatest songs, in 15 minutes, right? These are two people who are both musical geniuses, but in some crucial respect, they're totally different. Now, there's an economist named David Galenson who has thought a lot about this distinction, and he argues that what you're seeing in the difference between Leonard Cohen and Bob Dylan is something fundamental to the different forms that creativity takes. And he says that you can loosely group all creative geniuses into one of two categories. And the first category is what he calls a conceptual innovator. And a conceptual innovator is somebody who has a series of kind of very revolutionary ideas that they can very easily and precisely articulate, and that they can execute very quickly. And that these are people who tend to do their finest work at the very beginning of their career, because they have a kind of flash of insight and they put it into action, into whether we're talking about music or film or art. And the classic example of a conceptual innovator would be Picasso. So Picasso is someone who would create his paintings very, very quickly. He would always be able to explain to you exactly what he was doing before he did it. His paintings revolutionized the way we understood art in the eras in which he was working. And he absolutely does his finest work at the beginning of his career. The most valuable Picasso paintings to this day are the paintings that Picasso paints in his early 20s. But Galenson says that's only one category of genius. There's a wholly separate category of creative genius that he calls an experimental innovator. And the classic example of an experimental innovator would be Cézanne. So Cézanne is a contemporary, not a close contemporary, but a rough contemporary of Picasso. He's every bit the artistic genius that Picasso was. His paintings are as valuable today as Picasso's, but he works in a completely different way. He never has an idea that he can articulate. He doesn't execute things cleanly and quickly. He works entirely through trial and error. He's constantly like starting something and stopping it and throwing it out and starting over. He spends his entire 30s out in the countryside practicing his brushstrokes. And unlike Picasso, who does his finest work in his early 20s, Cézanne really doesn't produce anything of value until he's in his 50s. In fact, if you go to the Musée d'Orsay and you go into the Cézanne room and look at the dates that he painted some of his most famous works, it's all at the end of his life. He's someone who doesn't put it together until the very end because he's engaged in this constant form of experimentation and trial and error and kind of inchoate grasping at what he was trying to get at. And Galenson's argument is that a lot of what we think of genius falls into that second category, that we have a kind of too limited notion of what it means to be a genius. And that if you go through almost any creative field, you can see these two archetypes at play. So look at American literature. One of the most famous American novels is Moby Dick. You all read that in high school. Moby Dick is written by Herman Melville very, very quickly when he's 30 years old. He's a young man, and he comes out with this work which transforms American literature, right? Now think of another classic work of American literature, Huckleberry Finn by Mark Twain. Again, in the same, it's easy to group it with Moby Dick as another classic work of American fiction, but it couldn't be more different. Mark Twain takes 9 years to write Huckleberry Finn, in large part because he can't figure out how to end it. He's just constantly experimenting with different endings and being frustrated and banging his head against the wall. And he doesn't, he ends up coming up with Huckleberry Finn, his finest work, when he's 50 years old, 20 years after Herman Melville came out with Moby Dick. You could do the same thing in film. One of the most important, groundbreaking films of the 20th century is Orson Welles' Citizen Kane, right? It's on everyone's top 5 films of all time. Orson Welles, that's the first full-length feature that Orson Welles ever did, and he makes that movie at 24. That is classic conceptual innovation. He has a burst of creativity and produces this work of transcendent genius. Compare that to Alfred Hitchcock. Hitchcock is someone who spends years, decades in the wilderness, churning out one movie after another. In the beginning, they're all mediocre. He's working entirely within this very, very narrow film genre of thrillers. And it's not until the very end of his career that he actually catches stride, and he has that 7-year window where he produces, it's one of the greatest 7-year runs of any director in history, where he does Dial M for Murder, Rear Window, To Catch a Thief, Psycho, Vertigo, North by Northwest, and Psycho, right? There's never been a director who's had a run like that in 7 years. Well, those movies, those were Dial M for Murder was the 45th movie he'd done in his life. And he starts that incredible run at the age of 54, at an age that Orson Welles was washed up and forgotten, right? It's a completely different kind of creativity. Orson Welles and Herman Melville are Picasso, and Mark Twain and Alfred Hitchcock are Cézanne. Completely different models of creativity. So what about Bob Dylan and Leonard Cohen? Well, Bob Dylan is clearly in the Picasso mode. His most memorable song, Blowing in the Wind, he writes at the age of 21 in 10 minutes. He's in the Café Wad, just like 10 minutes from here, and just like dashes it off on a napkin, right? Whereas you have Leonard Cohen, who takes 5 years to produce his greatest work, Alleluia. Do you know how many verses he writes of Alleluia? We think it's somewhere between 80 and 180. He's just like endlessly doing at one point, there's a famous story of him in his underwear in his hotel room, literally knocking his head against the floor because he's so frustrated about how to complete this song. Finally, in 1984, he puts it on an album called Various Positions, and he takes it to Walter Yetnikoff, who was one of the famous figures in the music world in the 80s, so the guy who gave us Bruce Springsteen and Michael Jackson. And Yetnikoff is his music executive, and he plays this song for Yetnikoff, and Yetnikoff says, this song is terrible. I'm not even going to release it. So he goes and he releases it on an indie label, and it goes nowhere. No one's particularly interested in this music. So Cohen then goes back to the drawing board, and he rewrites it yet again. And he makes it 3 times longer, and he slows it down, and he takes out elements that he'd put in before, and he starts playing it in concerts, and just still trying to figure out how to make this thing work. And he's famously playing a concert at the Beacon, again, like 10 minutes that away, or is it that away, on the Upper West Side. And in the audience happens to be John Cale, who is was in the Velvet Underground and one of the great avant-garde musicians of his day. And Cale loves it. And Cale afterwards comes up to Cohen and says, will you send me the lyrics to that song? And of course, Cohen doesn't have lyrics, so he faxes him 15 pages of just kind of scribbles. And John Cale looks at the 15 pages, and he's the one who puts together Alleluia. It's an edit of this unfinished version that Leonard Cohen has come up with. And Cale ends, that famous ending of the song, which I might actually sing for you again, is John Cale's ending. It's not Leonard Cohen's ending. Remember? Maybe there's a God above. And I got such.
Maybe there's a God above, and all I ever learned from love is how to shoot at someone who outdrew you. It's not a crowd you hear tonight. It's not somebody who's seen the light. It's a cold and it's a broken hallelujah. Hallelujah. Hallelujah.
Not Leonard Cohen, John Cale, right? So he does his version, and he puts it on a tribute album for Leonard Cohen. It comes out in 1991. Put out by a French music magazine called I'm Your Fan, which nobody buys except weirdly me. I find it in a record store on Columbia Road in Washington, D.C. in a remainder bin. Loved it. Played it for all my friends. Someone else who buys it is a woman named Janine who lives in Park Slope. And she is a cat sitter who's a singer named Jeff Buckley. And Jeff Buckley hears it when he's cat sitting and says, this is amazing, and starts to play it at a club that used to be in the East Village called Chenet, a tiny little club. And while he's playing it one night, a record executive for Columbia Records hears it and signs Jeff Buckley to a contract, and he puts out an album called Grace, which is a famous album. Comes out in 1994. And it's that version that I'm guessing you're most familiar with. If you've ever heard Hallelujah, you've probably heard Jeff Buckley's version. And what you really are hearing is Jeff Buckley's cover of John Cale's cover of Leonard Cohen's 15 pages of faxed notes, right? And every subsequent cover of that, including the guy on the subway who you may have heard on your way here, but Bono's version, Katie Lang's version, Imogen Heap's version, Bon Jovi's version, they're all doing covers of Buckley's cover of Cale's version of Cohen's 15 pages of faxed notes. So the evolution finally reaches its natural end. No, it doesn't. The story's not over because nobody buys the Buckley version. Grace is not a hit. It's a dud. But Buckley starts touring, and in 1997, he's in Memphis, and he wades out into the Mississippi River singing Whole Lotta Love by Led Zeppelin, and he drowns tragically. And he's this beautiful guy with this ethereal voice, and something about the tragic nature of his death shakes the music listening world, and everyone starts to listen to Grace, his album, and discovers Alleluia. And finally, 15 years after Leonard Cohen came up with Alleluia in 1984, Alleluia becomes this massive international hit, right? 15 years and all these improbable twists and turns before we get the pleasure of this incredibly beautiful song. Now, why is this distinction so important? Because I think that when we encounter works of genius, we're thinking about Picasso in our heads. We're thinking that there's something about genius that is inevitable, that it's easy to see a work of genius in the beginning, that the path to success is really obvious, and that genius is going to come quickly, right? It's just going to happen overnight. All those things are evident in the Picassos of creativity, but none of those things are evident when it comes to someone like Leonard Cohen and Alleluia. What he's doing is not easily recognized. It does not come quickly. It takes forever, right? And the path to success is not obvious and inevitable. It takes 1,000 detours along the way, right? And the thing about that kind of genius is it's really, really easy to lose, right? We almost didn't get Alleluia. If Janine hadn't had Jeff Buckley as a cat sitter, if John Cale hadn't showed up that day in the Beacon Theater, there's a million, if Jeff Buckley hadn't walked out into the Mississippi singing A Whole Lot of Love, you would never have heard that song, right? And I think that's something that we need to remember whenever we come across these kinds of works of genius, right? We need to remember that we got lucky when it comes to a lot of genius. We got lucky with Cézanne, we got lucky with Huck Finn, and we got lucky with Alleluia. And we also need to ask ourselves, do we live in a world that's willing to have the patience and the forbearance to let those kinds of ideas come to light? And I really hope the answer is yes. Thank you.